Welcome to episode 14 of the History of BBC Micro Typing Games, where I look at games listings for the Beeb that were published in the many computing magazines of the 8-bit era. As well as trying to work out if it was actually worth the time it took to type these games in, I also tried to pick out a few interesting articles and adverts from the mags to help give a taste of the home computing scene at that time. After two specials in the last couple of episodes, this time I'm starting my look at the magazines and typing games of 1985. 1985 was a pivotal year for the BBC Micro in a number of ways. Sales of the computer began to slow down due to the domination of the lower-priced Sinclair Spectrum and Commodore 64, and the new challenge of Amstrad's CPC 464. The Beeb's high price point compared to those machines and problems with the production of the Electron contributed to financial problems for Acorn Computers, with them facing a winding up order early in 1985. The company was saved by a £10 million sale of shares to Olivetti, but the decline of the system as a preferred home computer would never be arrested. In contrast to that though, 1985 was possibly the best year for games on the BBC, as no doubt inspired by Elite, developers pushed the system to its limits and moved away from simple arcade-style games to more engrossing ones. Notable releases this year included Superior Software's Repton and Citadel, Acorn Soft's Revs, Micropower's Castle Quest, and a number of conversions of high-profile games from other systems, such as Way of the Exploding Fist, Beachhead and Spy Hunter. Magazine coverage of the system remained strong, with a few new magazines being launched that supported the Beeb, and typing games continued to be prevalent, which is obviously very handy for this series. I'll be looking at 5 games this time around, from magazines covering January to May of 85, so this is going to be a pretty big episode, and with that in mind, let's not waste any more time and dive into the first publication, the January 1985 issue of Computer and Video Games. Here we have the front cover of the magazine, and as is typical for this era, it's got some nice hand-drawn or hand-painted artwork. We've got some kind of superhero character in the foreground with an evil wizard in the background, and there's also some little monsters at the bottom causing some havoc for this character. Closer inspection of the hero's boots reveals that he's got the initials JBJ on them, which probably means that this image is meant to represent Jet Boot Jack, whose latest adventure you can win in a competition. 2 other competitions are also mentioned on the cover, one for Doomdark's Revenge and the other for the Spy vs Spy games, and aside from that there's not really any information about what's in this issue of the magazine, other than at the bottom it says there's listings for the Spectrum, Commodore, VIC-20 and more, and of course one of those more is the BBC Micro. Because I've got quite a lot to get through in this episode, I'm not going to be dwelling too much on any of the content, but I do want to take a look at this review section, mainly because it's headlined by the magazine's Game of the Month, which is the classic Activision title Ghostbusters, one of my favourites on the Commodore 64. This game was never released for the BBC Micro back in the 80s, but I do have fond memories of playing it on my friend's Commodore 64, and also got my own copy when I got my C64 in 1988. Coincidentally, after 40 years, a version of the game has just been released for the BBC Micro by a homebrew coder. I've had a quick play of that and it does seem pretty faithful to the original, so if you've always wanted to play Ghostbusters on the BBC Micro, finally now you can. Going back to the review, the introduction says reading this review may seriously affect your enjoyment of the film. Ghostbusters on the 64 closely follows the plot of the film which has just been released in this country. So there's a little bit of a spoiler warning there, but that's completely undone by the fact that one of the screenshots shows the Marshmallow Man, which is probably the one sequence in the film that you couldn't possibly predict was going to happen. The review goes into plenty of detail about the game, which does give several plot elements away, and it rounds up by saying the game is terrific. I saw the film at a preview last month and the game brings it all back to me. You may be confused by everything going on in the game if you haven't seen the film, so my advice is see the film and buy the game, you won't regret it. And the game deservedly receives 9 out of 10 for graphics, 10 out of 10 for sound, 9 for value and 9 for playability, none of which I think you could argue with at the point it was released. Skimming through the rest of the reviews, there are a few that are more on topic for a BBC focused video. Firstly, there's a review of Micropower's Mr. E, which is my favourite arcade clone on the BBC Micro, and that's rounded up by saying Mr. E is a fast, colourful game with good graphics and sound. If you're an arcade addict then you'll like this, and it's given 8 out of 10 across the board for the 4 review scores. On the following page is another Micropower game, Felix and the Evil Weevils, although it's just described as Felix in this review, and the roundup for that says a good game from Program Power. Program Power and Micropower were somewhat interchangeable at that point in time. It's hard but good, and again this one gets pretty good scores, with 8 out of 10 for graphics and sound, and 7 out of 10 for value and playability. And finally, a few pages on from that, there's a review of Bug Byte's Spectrum game Turmoil. I recently reviewed the MSX conversion of this game on Witchfinder's Gaming Vault, so I was interested to see what the magazines thought of the original Spectrum version. Much of the review likens the game to Manic Miner, which I don't personally think is that much of a compliment, but the overall scores are pretty decent again, with it getting 8 out of 10 across the board. I'm not sure I'd necessarily agree with that myself, but it was an interesting game, so if you want to check out my video for that, click on the link in the corner of the screen. Moving deeper into the magazine, on page 81 to be specific, there's this advert from Microsoft that offers you the opportunity to make new friends and enemies. It's advertising 2 programs for the Commodore 64 that would appear to be essential purchases for any budding games designer. The first of those is Games Creator, which it says comes with a step-by-step manual and 3 ready-to-play games. Each demonstrates some of the program's exceptional features: shapes, movement, speed, scrolling backgrounds, scoring, music, sound effects and many more, and you don't have to know any programming language to work with it. There's only one thing better than playing games, and that's inventing them. At $12.95 it sounds great, doesn't it? What they don't tell you though is that behind this fancy packaging, this is the very primitive games creation program used by Richard and David Darling to produce those terrible early Mastertronic games like Bionic Granny, Jungle Story, Darkstar and BMX Racers. So if you wanted to create games of that quality, this was the product to do it with. The second program they're advertising is GhostSprite, a versatile, easy-to-use sprite designer and tester which makes full use of the facilities of the Commodore 64. I know absolutely nothing about this one, but it says user-friendly GhostSprite can be operated almost entirely by joystick alone, with light pen and keyboard control options also included. At £9.95, maybe it was worth a punt. Right near the end of the magazine, on page 157, is an article called Bug Hunter, which seems to be a mishmash of different pieces of information, ranging from little programming routines to mistakes made in typing listings in previous issues, and also bugs with commercial software. In this edition alone, there's a routine for the Commodore 64 that makes the computer bleep every time you press a key, which saves you having to stare at the screen when typing in program listings. For Beeb users, Iceland's Carl Thorudson provides a 2-line program that generates an explosion sound effect, which I'm pretty sure by this point you could have found in almost every game listing published for the Beeb. Spectrum owners are informed about a cheat in Daley Thompson's Decathlon and also a bug in the Melbourne House game Mugsy, and the rest of the article covers a variety of mistakes in previously published game listings, ranging from syntax errors to missing lines, and at the bottom there's also a case of mistaken computer identity, as it says apologies to all Commodore 64 owners who tried typing in Boxer from December's issue. Owing to an error on our part, the game is actually for the VIC-20 and not the 64, and while we're at it, apologies to all those VIC readers who think they now have a free Boxer game. It's actually called Ghosty. I think what this demonstrates is that it was probably better to leave it a month or two before typing in any games from this or any other magazine, just to save possible disappointment. Time to look at the game listing from this magazine now, and this is Super Sharks, described as the Game of the Month. That's typing Game of the Month, of course, not to be confused with the commercial Game of the Month, which we already saw was Ghostbusters. This initial 2-page spread shows an impressive looking screenshot of the game, but it suffers from some serious colour choice issues, as that pink introductory text on the blue background is so hard to read that I'm not even going to try. I'll just assume it gives an overview of the gameplay that we'll see in the in-game instructions. There's no rundown of the game structure or summary of the procedures or variables, so you're very much on your own with working out how this one fits together. The listing consists of 2 programs, the first of which declares all the graphical elements, generates a title screen and displays the instructions, while the second contains the actual game code. There are about 170 lines across the 2 programs, spread across 5 pages, with several pages of adverts to skip past too. The listing is printed clearly and in a fairly large text size. There is one of those where the code is printed in several oddly aligned boxes on each page. I feel like they could have fit this on 4 pages without those unnecessary design choices. There's very little here we've not seen before in these basic listings, so I'm not going to dig into the code very much, other than to mention a procedure that's called at the beginning of the first program called procblot. This takes in 4 parameters, one of which is a word, and you can see it's going to do something with the words that make up the title of the game. The procedure is defined on line 310 and uses the BBC's familiar graphical plotting commands, and we'll see in a moment that this does something quite interesting. When the game starts up, it draws a title screen rather slowly, printing the name of the game 1 letter at a time. This is where that procedure I was just talking about comes into play, as if you look closely at the very bottom left corner of the screen, you can see each letter being printed in magenta text on the red background, and then slowly disappearing as the larger version of the letter is printed above. Procblot is picking apart the pixels that make up each letter one at a time and expanding them into full characters to print the larger version. I think this is a pretty neat routine that could easily be reused for title screens on other games. Once all the letters that make up the title of the game have been completed, they cycle through a number of colours until you press a key to move on to the instructions. The instructions are printed in a rather psychedelic colour combination of magenta text on a yellow background, but at least you can read them unlike in the magazine. They say you control an undersea station with 3 missile bases for protection. Sounds a little bit like Missile Command. Your station is in constant need of supplies which arrive in ships. Unfortunately for you, your evil enemy has found out how your supplies arrive and has unleashed deadly mechanical sharks whose only aim in life is to wipe you out. Your only defence is to fight back with the missile bases, using keys 1 to 3 to fire from the respective bases. Just to make it more difficult, water currents upset your fire and can lead to the destruction of your supply ships. You lose a life when you run out of ammunition and can't get enough supplies, when a shark dives to your station, or when you sink all your ships. And with that it says good luck and press any key, and doing so will load the second part of the game. You're then presented with a simple screen in mode 7 that displays the high score and gives you a reminder of the controls, which is simply to press keys 1 to 3 to fire the respective bases. Pressing any key will then start the game proper. As described in the instructions, the aim of the game is pretty simple. All you've got to do is fire missiles from the 3 bases at the bottom of the screen, and try and hit the sharks which move back and forth across the top. Eliminate all the sharks on one stage and you'll move on to the next where the mission's repeated. The real jeopardy in the game comes from the fact that you've only got a limited amount of ammunition, and you can also hit the supply boats at the top of the screen. Run out of ammo or destroy all the boats and a life is lost. The graphics in this one are really well designed, with the shark sprite in particular being excellent. The boats look good too, and I like how the green parts are used to indicate the hull being submerged under the waves. There are also some nicely drawn weeds on the seabed along with your bases, which have a familiar Space Invaders style look. The sound effects aren't bad, though they are pretty standard noises for shots and explosions, but the rendition of Rule Britannia that's played between stages is pretty awful. Presentation is well done across the board too, from that routine generating the large letters on the title screen to a detailed status bar in-game which records a high score if you manage to last long enough. The gameplay is very simple, and it didn't take long for me to learn just to use the bases on the left and right of the screen, as they have a better chance of hitting the sharks when they come into range. The shark diving down does add some panic, and it is cool that you can still shoot it before it attacks one of your bases, but it doesn't happen very often, so there isn't much variety to proceedings. It's not very interactive for the player, as all you're doing is firing a shot and hoping it hits, and because you have no control over the direction of shots due to the movement of the water, it can get annoying. It really needs an indicator of which way the tide is going, so you have a chance of timing and targeting the shots better. It's not far from being a decent if simplistic game to be honest, but I think it would be more fun if you just had one base that you could move, Space Invaders style, and a more reliable way of targeting your shots. As it stands, it's impressive from a visual perspective, but a little too boring to want to play for long. The next game I'm going to look at comes from the February 1985 issue of Your Computer magazine, and as you can see the big headline on the cover of this one is Whatever Next from the Arcades, which is accompanied by a rather blurry photo of a screen from Pac-Land. Also mentioned on the cover is the opportunity to win Sinclair's new Micro, Wheels and All, which I presume is referring to the Sinclair C5 that you can see plonked above it. Also mentioned on the cover are a number of programs for different systems, some of which I assume are type-ins, and I know at least one of them is because Hold Up is the BBC Micro game that I'm going to be looking at. First up in this magazine I'm going to move to the news pages where there's several interesting articles. There's a write-up about the Sinclair C5, but I've covered that quite extensively in previous editions of this series, although I do like the headline here, Night on a White Recharger Saves British Tricycle Industry. I don't think they're taking the C5 too seriously. Below that article, in the face of Sir Clive Sinclair, is another well-known face from this era, Jack Tramiel, who at this point had been ousted from Commodore, the company he founded, but taken over as chairman of Atari. While it begins talking about the 8-bit XL and XE ranges, the more interesting information here is about the upcoming Atari 16-bit computers. It says Atari's new QL bashers based on the Motorola 68000 will start at $500 with the 130 ST, which has 128K, mouse, icons, and all which begins to sound more like a Macintosh than a Sinclair, and goes up to $800 for the half megabyte 520 ST. It goes on to say Atari UK is saying nothing yet about when we can expect to see these machines this side of the Atlantic or what the prices will be. This article effectively marks the dawn of the 16-bit home computer era, at least for ones that are actually affordable, though it is quite amusing that they're comparing the upcoming ST range with Sinclair's QL, which was a complete flop. On the opposite page is a piece entitled Personal Assistant is Undercover BBC B. This is about Acorn hoping to have the first of its ABC computers based on a re-engineered BBC B in the shops by the end of the month. It goes on to say the Personal Assistant, as the bottom of the range model is called, will be a package of a new keyboard containing a slimmed down BBC and built-in View word processor and ViewSheet spreadsheet on ROM, together with a monochrome screen including a built-in disk drive. The price is likely to be less than £1,000. The reduced chip count Electron style will also be used in the BBC, which will be able to offer additional features or dramatically drop in price as a result. A tight-lipped Acorn spokesman would only say that's one of the ways of making it cheaper to produce. The piece is rounded up by hinting at those financial problems that I mentioned Acorn were having at the end of 1984. It says price cuts for the BBC are coming anyhow after a bad Christmas for Acorn. The company admits that Electron sales were not in the same league as Commodore or Sinclair. I'd never seen or heard of this ABC system before, and reading up about it on Wikipedia, it seems that the range was cancelled before anything was ever actually produced and put on sale. And finally in this news section, there's this amusing article entitled Cambridge Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us, and it says that Sir Clive's much publicised Christmas punch-up with Chris Curry of Acorn in the Baron of Beef pub in Cambridge is not the only example of an isolated occurrence in the computer industry. Not quite sure what they mean by that, but it goes on to say the two multimillionaires may have been unlucky to have been caught brawling in public after their respective companies' end-of-year parties, but similar feuds have been running elsewhere. Reading further down, it says Sinclair is supposed to have made contact again with Scum, as he called his ex-employee Chris Curry, and the pair are supposed to be the best of friends again. It says the fracas happened on the Friday before Christmas when Sir Clive lashed out with a furled copy of a magazine because he was angry about Acorn's dishonest advertising. So there you go, Christmas 1984 was obviously a very tense and competitive time in the 8-bit computer industry. I've moved on now to that cover feature entitled Into the Arcades, which rounds up the current state of play in arcades across the world. As a big fan of arcade games, this was an interesting read, but there's too much information to go through entirely on this video. I do recommend taking a look at it though if you're especially interested in arcade games. One of the key areas it talks about is the rise in Laserdisc games, mentioning that even those may make it onto home systems as a Laserdisc add-on was being launched for the MSX. There's also a quote from Nintendo's head of arcade games in the US, Minoru Arakawa, who said there are no real games on Laser yet, it's just a matter of reflexes and timing, no skill or strategy on the part of the player is involved. The writer of the article then says that Nintendo has no laser games of its own, so perhaps it's just sour rice on his part. But given that Nintendo were working on the NES at that point and were already moving away from arcade machines, I don't really think they had anything to be jealous of. It also talks about the ease at which operators are converting older machines to house new games, saying all you have to do is slot one in and change the labels to turn your Pac-Man machine into Pac-Land. This was rather inaccurate since Pac-Land has a different connector, used buttons for control and had a horizontal monitor, whereas Pac-Man only had a joystick and a vertical monitor. But that aside, this was common practice which led to a lot of classic early 80s cabs being butchered, much to the annoyance of present day arcade game collectors. As I said, there's loads of other interesting information in this feature too, but I haven't really got time to go through it all, so let's move on to later in the magazine and this advert from US Gold, which is arcade related too. As I'm sure you already know, US Gold were famous for their arcade conversions, although not many of them were actually that good. Here we've got an advert that's focused on home conversions of a number of Sega arcade games, although actually half of them weren't actually manufactured by Sega in the arcades, because Spy Hunter, Up and Down and Tapper were all produced by Bally Midway. Nevertheless, there are 3 Sega games as well in the form of Buck Rogers, Zaxxon and Congo Bongo, and overall the advert's very nicely presented with some good cover art and some screenshots too. The 3 Bally Midway games shown here all made it onto US Gold's first compilation, Arcade Hall of Fame, which was released at the end of 1985, and I reviewed that in my Commodore 64 compilation comparison series, so if you're interested in hearing what I thought about those 3 games, then check that out. Let's move on to the game listing from this magazine then, and this is Hold Up, and in the top right hand corner it says Bag Some Swag with Barry Wakeling on the BBC, and there's a nice screenshot of the game there which looks pretty impressive. You can see a character running across the bottom of the screen with a number of objects falling from the top by the looks of it, and some walls in the way. The overview of the game says the idea is to cross the screen and collect the bags of swag and return with them to the getaway car. You'll be hampered by falling bombs and aided by stone defences. Each level more bombs will fall and after a specified number of points either one of the 2 blocks will be renewed. Don't quite understand that because there's clearly 3 blocks on the screenshot there. It also says that on each level the program will play a new tune. It knows 4 different ones. It then goes on to say that the program is in 3 parts, or there are 4 parts to type in, so surely that's 4 parts, and it says the first part loads the others and sets up the UDGs, which I think is user defined graphics, and envelopes, that's relating to the sound. The second part makes the machine code and stores the multicoloured characters, and the final part is the basic program. It then gives the instructions of how to type each program in and what to save it as, followed by some information about storing high and low bytes, which I can't really be bothered to read. That's about all I'm going to cover for this listing, because as you can see the text size for 3 of the 4 listings is absolutely minuscule. Even when I zoom in I can't really read it due to the poor scan quality of this magazine. The only one of the programs that is readable is the machine code one, and that's probably for the best because of how complex the commands are. Unfortunately, I don't really understand machine code, so most of that's just gibberish to me. Given the other 3 programs contain some very long data statements, I think it would have been a miracle if you managed to type this in right first time, and I applaud whoever it was that typed it in for the BBC Micro Games Archive, where I downloaded my copy from. So let's take a look at it now and see if their hard work paid off. As usual, we have some instructions, but they just repeat what I've already read out from the magazine, so let's move swiftly on, and pressing space loads the game and you can see the title screen with the name of the game drawn using graphical plotting commands. A short tune then plays and you're presented with another screen full of information giving you all the options for the game, which can be changed by pressing C. It also gives you the keyboard controls, which are either Z and X or greater than and less than for left and right. You can also switch the sound on and off during the game, and you press space to start. As the instructions already stated, the aim of the game is to move your man from left to right across the bottom of the screen, collecting the bag of swag on the right hand side and then transporting it back to the left. While you're doing this, a torrent of bombs are falling from the top of the screen, and contact with those will cost you a life, with an ambulance coming to pick you up if you die. The value of each bag of swag retrieved is random, and once you've achieved the required target for the level, you'll move on to the next, where the number and speed of bombs increases. This game is pretty close to commercial level when it comes to the presentation, graphics and sound. There's some really nice multicoloured sprites, especially the player character and the ambulance that appears when you lose a life, both of which could only be generated using machine code. Several music tracks are included, which play during the game, along with some appropriate sound effects. The title screen, high score table, choice of keyboard controls and configurable game options round out an impressive offering. Gameplay is very simple, as you just have to collect the bags of loot whilst avoiding the falling bombs, and the responsive controls help with the precise movement that's required to do that. The columns of protective blocks get destroyed really quickly due to the vast number of falling objects, and you have to be really quick off the mark to take advantage of the initial cover they give. The bombs do tend to fall in a way that can be avoided most of the time with quick reactions, but it would have been more forgiving if there weren't so many of them to begin with. It's also not fair that there are objects falling on the very left hand side of the screen where you respawn after dying, as sometimes you can get hit as soon as you materialise. The game is quite addictive to begin with and looks great, but it's also very hard and rather repetitive. It really needs something more added to the gameplay to make it less frustrating and more varied. The ability to change the game settings can help make it easier and is a good feature, but that seemed to be bugged in the version I played, as you can't change them and get an out of range message. I was impressed by the multicoloured graphics and music in this one, but I think the magazine listing was too complex and too hard to read to have been worth typing in, as the resulting game is a little too simple to have been worth the effort. Let's move on to another magazine now, and this is issue number 103 of Home Computing Weekly, with the cover date of March the 12th to the 18th, 1985, and that man Sir Clive Sinclair is on the front cover again, this time with the headline, "After the C5 it's the Mobile Micro." This is talking about Sinclair's next project, which is a portable home computer based on the Spectrum architecture. But that's not the news item I'm interested in on this front page, because in the bottom right hand corner there's another piece that continues the story about Acorn's financial problems. The headline says Acorn pledges to back home users, and the article says Acorn chairman Alexander Reed faced the press to explain the events leading up to Acorn's financial crisis and emphasise its continuing support for both the BBC and Electron. Quotes from Reed say Acorn have no intention whatsoever of withdrawing from the home computer market, and the company will continue to be selling the Electron at least through the year and thereafter. It also says that the BBC has effectively had a price cut with a £50 trade-in deal which is now available. Dr. Reed was refuting the rumours that Acorn would pull out of home computing after the Italian business machine company Olivetti bought up 49.3% of Acorn's shares to enable the company to resolve its financial difficulties. Reed didn't envisage any problem with the continuation of the BBC scheme for supplying micros to school, saying the BBC isn't frightened by international links and Italian school markets are very high on their list of priorities. Not really much more to say about that, as all those comments were fairly factual, as the BBC and other Acorn systems did continue to be produced beyond this point in time. On the subject of the BBC Micro and its educational credentials, that theme continues inside the magazine, as on page 24 there's a 2-page spread for the BBC Educational Awards. John Henderson looks at the best and worst of educational software for the BBC for use at home and in schools. The opening paragraph says, as the BBC is the most common computer in educational use, this article looks back at the hits of the last 12 months on this machine, and there's a number of accolades given, including Best Package, Best Adventure, Most Changed Software, Most Deplorable Programme, Best Software House, Best Simulation and Hit of the Year. There's also a very cunningly placed advert in the bottom half of the right hand page from Formation Educational Resources, publisher of the famous Granny's Garden amongst other titles. The one programme mentioned in this article that brought back memories for me was the one given the Best Adventure Award, which was L, the Mathemagical Adventure. This text adventure came from the Association of Teachers of Mathematics, and the object, according to this article, was to survive long enough on your mathematical wit to beat off the menaces threatening your progress. Despite not being a huge fan of text adventures generally, I do remember playing this quite a bit both at school and at home. As I remember it, the aim was to escape from a castle, and to do so you have to move around as you normally do in these games, but also solve a number of mathematical problems. The one thing that I recall vividly is that sometimes robots would enter your location, each having a number on its chest, and to defeat them you had to enter the square root of their number. I know I never completed the game, but it was more interesting than the standard text adventures of that time, and it's worth a look if you've never played it. Something I like to look at in at least one of the magazines each episode is the games charts, and here's a state of play in March 1985 according to Home Computing Weekly, with these charts compiled by Gallup, the well-known chart compilers of the era. We have a top 20 covering all formats and 3 system-specific top 10s, which surprisingly include the BBC Micro along with the more predictable Spectrum and Commodore 64. The multi-format chart is topped by the recently released Alien 8 from Ultimate, closely followed by Activision's Ghostbusters and US Gold's Raid over Moscow. A more surprising entry is Booty in 5th place, which is a terrible game on the C64, though I'm told the Specky version is better. Also noteworthy is that another game I hate, Manic Miner, is still going strong in the top 10 almost 2 years after its release. It's nice to see a couple of games that originated on the Beeb doing well though, namely Elite in 10th place and Frack in 18th. The BBC chart is surprisingly not topped by Elite though, with Micropower's Castle Quest taking first place. That doesn't really make sense since Elite was only available on the BBC and Electron at that point, and Castle Quest doesn't feature in the multi-format chart at all, but whatever. Other games I enjoyed on the Beeb that stand out in that chart are Football Manager in 3rd and Saberwolf in 6th. It's a bit of a shame that almost all the games in that chart are multi-platform offerings, but I think that would change in the future as more high-quality BBC originals were released and less games from other systems were ported over. Time to look at the games listing then, and this, according to the magazine, is Desert Race, although it only takes a quick look at the REM statement at the top of the listing to see that in-game this is actually called Camel Race. There's a nice illustration of 2 racing camels, and the introduction says the sand's flying in this camel race, place your money and take your seats for Richard Webb's game. A very short introduction sets the scene saying place your bet on one of 6 camels, then watch them race. Each camel has its own odds, which invariably prove true to form. VDU commands are used to define the camel, not much sound is included but you can add your own if you wish. Well, they're not really bigging it up there, are they? Following that intro there are 3 box outs, one explaining how the program works, one giving a list of the variables, and the final one is quite interesting. It gives you some suggestions for if you want to convert it to another system, saying if you want to convert this program to the C64 or VIC-20 you'll need to change all print tabs and characters, but it doesn't say what you need to change them to, so you'd really need to know your stuff with those other systems to be able to convert it, and I feel like they've oversimplified that. The program listing then takes up the remainder of the page, along with half of the following page, and the final line number is 3000, but if you look more closely there are obviously much fewer lines than that because the preceding line number is 1530, and you only have to go about 10 lines back from that to get to line 1000. Clearly the programmer of this game either didn't know or didn't care about renumbering. There's also quite a lot of REM statements, so those could be omitted to make it even shorter. The layout of the listing is decent and the text size is perfectly readable, so this would be a really quick and easy one to type in if you wanted to. In terms of what the program's doing, this is a very basic listing. There's not really anything going on here that I haven't covered in previous episodes of this series, although it is noteworthy that this program uses ghost subs rather than procedures to control the program flow. So this isn't looking like the most complex or well written of programs by any means, but that doesn't mean it's going to result in a terrible game. Let's take a look at it and find out. The game begins by playing a short and frankly awful tune, before drawing a bunch of camels at the top and bottom of the screen and showing you the instructions. Those instructions say welcome to the camel races. The idea of the game is to gain as much money as you can within 6 camel races. What it actually means there though is that each race has 6 camels in it. There isn't a limit of 6 races. It then says each player starts with £100 and each camel has its own odds. The thing is though, it's a 1-player game. When it says each player that would suggest it's a multiplayer game, but it isn't, it's for 1 player only. Pressing a key starts the game and you're presented with a list of 6 camels, each with its own odds. You enter the number of the camel you wish to bet on, and then you're asked how much you wish to gamble of your initial £100. Once you've entered the amount, the race begins and you'll see the 6 camels dashing across the screen to the finish line. I think you can probably guess what happens from this point on. If you back the right camel, you win some money, and if you don't, you lose some. You'll then move on to the next race, and the process continues until you run out of cash or patience. It was obvious from the listing that this game was going to be pretty simple, but even so, it still managed to disappoint. One plus point is that the Camel graphics are nicely drawn and comically animated, but it's all downhill from there. As the magazine warned, there are no in-game sound effects, and in fact the only sound you'll hear was that monotonous intro tune when the game starts. I've always found gambling games on computers to be quite dull because ultimately you're not winning or losing real money, but this game is basically just a glorified random number generator. The intro in the mag said that the camels invariably stay true to form, but that's not the case as often the longer shots win and the same camel doesn't win consistently. Even if you bet on the odds-on favourite, you're still not guaranteed to win, which is exactly how real gambling works of course, but in this case there are no suggestions on which camel is in form. The length of the course is too short, so no real tension is created as the races are over in seconds, and that, combined with the inability to use any kind of strategy, makes the game almost immediately boring. All you have to aim for is to last as many races as possible, but once you've seen one, there's nothing to keep you interested. It really needs elements like varying course conditions and different characteristics for the camels, so there's more of a decision to make on which one to bet on. Also, the odds should change if a longer shot wins, but they're the same every race. Support for multiple players would have more enjoyment as you could compete with a rival to see how much money you can amass, and it should probably have a limit to the number of races to give you the chance to achieve a high score too. The good news is that the programme is so short and simple that it would be easy to embellish it with some of these ideas if you wanted to, but as it stands it's no fun at all. Before moving on to the next magazine, I just want to say a big thank you to one of my new channel members, PXL Cool, who not only became a member but also gave me a very generous super thanks on one of my BBC typing videos recently. Your support is greatly appreciated and I hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to join him and my other members in my Supporters Hall of Fame and also get yourself some member only perks, please click the join button below this video for more information, with no obligation to sign up. Next up, we're moving into April 1985 and another issue of Your Computer magazine. And on the front here is a guy that we've already seen once in this episode. It's Jack Tramiel, the chairman of Atari at this point in time. And he's standing in front of the brand new Atari ST, which was due for release later that year, and I'll be taking a look at the article related to that in a minute. Also mentioned on the front cover is BBC Grand Prix, which is the game I'm going to be looking at from this magazine. First up though is this 2-page advert from Vector, who say you can now buy the complete range of Acorn Soft cassettes, discs and ROMs from them. This is something I've not seen in any previous magazines, and I wonder if it's got something to do with Acorn's financial problems. Maybe they outsourced the distribution of the games to this Vector company rather than handling it themselves. Anyway, you can see a lineup of some of their most popular titles on the left hand page, including a couple of my favourites, Hopper and Labyrinth, and of course the hugely popular Elite. Prices for the games at this point seem to be pretty standard at $9.95 for a BBC cassette, $11.50 for a disc, and for some reason the Electron versions are a lot cheaper at $6.99. The exception is of course Elite, which costs $12.95 and $14.95 respectively for the Electron and BBC cassette versions, and randomly £17.65 for the BBC disc version. Moving on just a few pages from that into the news section, and we have yet another story related to Acorn's financial problems, this one entitled Acorn Survives, Olivetti Money to the Rescue. This largely covers the same ground as the other articles I've looked at, but there are a couple of extra points that are worth noting here. Firstly, it lays bare the problems that Acorn had, saying with £47 million worth of debts and the share price crashing from 193 to 28 pence before trading was suspended in February, Acorn was in desperate need of a rescue operation. Poor Christmas sales and £10 million losses on the failed attempt to break into the American market had created the crisis. Italian typewriter and micro maker Olivetti has bought nearly half of Acorn for £10 million with the option to make that majority shareholding, but the BBC will keep their deal with Acorn for the moment. There's also a picture of Acorn chairman Alex Reid with the amusing caption, "Favourite food, spaghetti." And at the end of the story it says the Electron will still be sold, but there are big stockpiles so it may never go back into production. It also mentions the ABC range that I looked at in a news article earlier, saying it will now just be sold to the specialist research and development market, and there's still no word as to when the BBC will be replaced and what with. Well, the answer to that came the following year, but I'll cover that in a future episode. I've now moved on to that cover story about the upcoming Atari ST, and this is a pretty big article which I'm obviously not going to go through in too much detail, but there are a couple of interesting bits of information that I do want to pick out. The first of those is a mention that the micro industry was wobbling at this point in time, with Commodore announcing falling annual sales figures for the first time, Sinclair having to delay stock market flotation, Acorn's aforementioned financial issues, and smaller companies like Oric falling into the hands of receivers. Amongst all that turmoil, Camel was proudly boasting that it would produce a record 5 million Atari computers that year, confident that the market's there for the right product at the right price. The article then goes on to talk about the ST's revolutionary Graphics Environment Manager, or GEM for short, that softens the barrier between the user and the machine. It describes the interface as a window icon mouse program which gives systems like GEM the unfortunate generic acronym of WIMP, and goes on to say that these first appeared in production on Apple's £6,000 Lisa Micros in 1981 before graduating to the Macintosh in 1983. Camel points out though that the ideas originated in Xerox Palo Alto laboratory 10 years ago, saying Xerox developed it, Apple copied it, and he improved it. This is of course talking about a rudimentary Windows environment, and goes on to say the screen on a WIMP machine is covered with icons in inverted commas, something home users weren't particularly familiar with at this point, describing them as images representing the sort of objects you might find scattered across a desk, a calculator, files, even small pictures of floppy disks, hard disks, and so on. Given interfaces like this have been in use for a good 35 years now, it's quite amusing to see them described in such an unusual fashion. I'm going to skim over most of the rest of the article, which is an in-depth overview of the ST hardware and capabilities, and move on to the final column that begins by saying if Atari can keep all of Camel's promises for the year, the opposition will have two choices: sit back and watch Jack clean up, or bring in radical new products themselves. It goes on to say Sinclair is now thought to have authorised modifications to turn the QL into a WIMP, and although Commodore is shouting loudest about the upcoming Commodore 128, it's expected to release its new Amiga Lorraine-based 68000 micro at the Hanover Fair later that month. It closes out the article by saying either way, the cassette-based games-only home computer may be on its last legs by the end of the year. I don't think it was quite that dramatic, but 1985 certainly marked the beginning of the era of disc-based home computers with more user-friendly mouse-driven operating systems that we're all accustomed to nowadays. Let's move on to the game listing from this one, and this is Grand Prix Racer, and just like the other game we looked at in the earlier edition of Your Computer, this one looks like a bit of a beast based on this two-page spread, with several different listings, some of which have a text size that's so tiny you'd need a magnifying glass to read it. Looking at the screenshot though, this does look like it could be quite a decent 3D racing game. The opening paragraph says your chance to join the Kings of Speed, jockeying for position as they push their sleek technological thoroughbreds to the utmost limits. No, it's not the South Circular at 8:30 in the morning, but a Grand Prix race simulation for the BBC Model B or the Model A with 32K. The warnings about the complexity of this program come early though, as it says restrain the urge to strap on your leather goggles and gloves for a bit, keying in the program is already awkward enough. It then goes on to give some information about a number you can change to change the difficulty level of the game, before saying that there are 5 different stages which include countryside, snow, desert, night and riverside scenes. It then summarises what to do to put this program together, and it does sound complicated, as you have to type in one listing and save it, then type in the second one and save it on the same tape, and then type listings 3 and 4 on a separate tape. At the end, the author says typing in the program, especially listing 4, will be a long process, so for anybody who doesn't have the time, he'll send it to them on a high quality C15 cassette for £3.50. Just like the earlier listing from Your Computer, there's no helpful summary of variables and procedures, and as I've already mentioned, several elements of the listing are very hard to read. Listing 1 in particular is tiny, whereas listing 2 at the top of the page is actually fairly easy to make out. The real confusing one is listing 3, which starts with a really small text size, listing hundreds of data statements, before then moving to a larger one for the latter half. The program continues on the following page, and listing 4 is primarily machine code commands, and the text size is absolutely minuscule. Given listings 3 and 4 are the most demanding and also the most important to get right, I think this one would have been an absolute chore to type in, and I'm certainly not going to be looking at it in any detail. Instead, let's just move on to the game and see if it's anywhere near as impressive as that screenshot. It begins with a concise but well presented Mode 7 instructions screen, which reminds me of some of the Acorn Soft games. The controls are listed, which are the BBC standard, and at the bottom it says you must get a bonus of over 70 to qualify for the next stage. If you stay still for too long, other cars will crash into you. That's all you get for the instructions, and pressing space will start the game, and it begins by slowly drawing the sky on the screen along with some clouds, before eventually rendering the racetrack. Your car then appears at the bottom of the screen, and the race is on. This is a very well put together game that takes heavy influence from a few classic driving games. Graphically it looks very much like Pole Position, but the gameplay is more like Sega's arcade game Turbo or the Atari 2600 classic Enduro, where you just have to pass a specified number of cars per stage to continue, in this case 70. There's no cornering, it's just a long straight road, but if you reach another stage the scenery does change a little, which is exactly what happens in Enduro. The graphics are really good for a typing game, and the road movement is smooth and gives a pretty convincing illusion of speed. The computer controlled car graphics are just a colour swap of your vehicle. They lack variety and are also quite flickery and clip each other sometimes, occasionally leaving artifacts behind on the screen. Sound effects are pretty standard for this kind of game, but good enough, with the engine noise being the standout. It actually sounds just like the engine noise in the classic BBC game Daredevil Dennis. The premise of the game may sound simple, but it is very hard to pass the number of cars you need to get to the next stage. Once you get up to a certain speed, it doesn't change much, and the cars come at regular intervals for you to pass. You need precision, fast reactions and a bit of luck, as sometimes they will split, while other times they'll stay together and are impossible to avoid if you made the wrong decision. Slowing down when they appear on the horizon rarely helps, as they come towards you too quickly for you to react. The most annoying aspect of the game is when you crash, then get hit by a car from behind after restarting. A few seconds grace to give you the chance to get going again would be good. I probably had 20 to 30 tries of the game before finally getting past 70 cars, and then surprisingly made it to stage 3. You do rack up a score during the game, but no high score is recorded when the game ends, which is a shame. Grand Prix is certainly an impressive game for a magazine listing, but it would benefit from a more generous time limit on the first stage or a lower number of cars to pass, just to allow you to get further without needing a near perfect run. It's also a very complex one to type in, with lots of places to make mistakes and a lot of the code being hard to read. Unless you had a lot of patience, it may have been better to take the programmer up on their offer and buy a copy from them, though it's questionable whether it would have been worth £3.50. Moving on to the final game of this episode and sticking with April 1985, this is the debut issue of Computer Gamer magazine, transmission number 1 as it says in the top right hand corner, and it's got a nice distinctive logo at the top, accompanied by a pretty decent image of a purple alien overlooking the Earth. It looks quite friendly for a change though. At the bottom of the front cover it gives a preview of the kind of thing you're going to get from this magazine, including screenshot reviews where you can see what you're buying, a fantastic gamers club, approaching adventures for the beginner, and mega games to type in for all popular computers, which is obviously the significance of the magazine for this video. Since this is the first issue of a brand new magazine, let's start by taking a look at the editorial and see what the producers of this magazine think they've got that sets it apart from the dozens of magazines already available at this time. Somewhat bizarrely, the first editorial for this magazine says, "Let me introduce our esteemed interplanetary advisor. Econ was born approximately 473 Earth years ago on the planet Argon. Argon is in the system Goldar, the 8th of 12 planets circling the star Arspan. The Argonians are a highly advanced race who have monitored developing civilizations for eons. One of their most experienced observers is Econ, a technician of the Association of Supreme Players. Having displayed a special interest and affection for Earth and its computer-talented inhabitants, he's requested permission from his Supreme Leader to further develop his links with Earth and to offer help and advice to the computer gamers living there. Econ made interstellar contact with the staff of Argus Specialist Publications with a view to giving Earthlings the benefit of his vast computer gaming experience. After extensive discussions between the interested parties, it was decided that the best and most efficient way for Econ to give the most help to Earth's inhabitants was for Argus to publish a monthly magazine called Computer Gamer. That was weirdly elaborate. It then goes on to have the intergalactic transmission from Econ, saying, "I, Econ, Master Gamer of Argon, have observed from afar the need for guidance in the noble quest for gaming perfection. Valiant gamers, however talented or dedicated, rarely master all the types of games that can be conjured up by the melding of the human mind and the microprocessor. However, this is where I can aid ailing addicts. With the staff of Computer Gamer, I hope to enlighten the gamers of Earth with their gaming problems. Whether you've got a rusty joystick wrist, fall off every platform, lose yourself in adventures or get blasted by every nasty alien around, I've got the answers." So that really didn't tell us very much at all about what's in the magazine and was actually quite patronising, but let's hope the rest of the magazine is more impressive. The first article I'm going to take a look at is entitled US Scene, and it's actually a report from the Winter Consumer Electronics Show that was held in Las Vegas during January 1985. There's lots of interesting information here, including some coverage of the launch of the Atari ST, which I've already mentioned a couple of times already in this video, and also a brief mention of the MSX being on show, with Panasonic demonstrating their Tron-like Laserdisc games to amazed onlookers. Again, I've already mentioned that once in this video as well. There are two new and more interesting stories here though, the first one saying oddly enough it was a player leaving the software arena that set the tone for the Winter CES show. On the eve of the show, Coleco retreated back to the relative security of selling Cabbage Patch dolls, no doubt leaving thousands of bemused ColecoVision and Adam computer owners wondering whether they'd invested in computerised white elephants. Needless to say, Coleco's stand was pathetically devoid of people, save for a handful of embarrassed-looking employees. It goes on to say many other casualties were conspicuous by their absence, including HES, Datamost and KTEL, all of whom were listed as exhibitors on the show guide. Other companies, also obviously feeling the pinch, were peddling their wares on significantly smaller stands than at the summer CES 6 months ago. This of course is demonstrating the aftermath of the big video game crash in the States, which didn't really affect us in Europe. The second interesting bit of news is annoyingly spread across 2 pages and begins with the title Remember? It says everybody remembers Nintendo's miniature LCD Game & Watch games, but what have they been up to since? The answer is on Nintendo's tastefully designed stand where they launched their Advanced Video System. The AVS is a futuristically designed no-spaghetti video game machine featuring a 52-colour high-resolution display and an impressive range of software. Programming and music keyboards will be available during the year. One gets the feeling that this will either be hugely successful or a complete flop. The AVS was a prototype of Nintendo's attempt to adapt their popular Famicom system for US markets. According to Wikipedia, the booth at the show was very busy and attendees acknowledged the advanced technology but responded poorly to the keyboard and wireless functionality. Nintendo would of course redesign the system, dropping the keyboard and other home computer elements, and it would become the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. The rest is history. After a shaky start with that weird editorial, this actually looks like quite a decent magazine. There's a roundup of the latest arcade games with plenty of colour screenshots, and that's followed by an impressive 15 pages of game reviews. Each game gets a comprehensive write-up and a rating out of 5 stars, with the majority having screenshots, and all the major home computers of the time seem to be covered, including some less popular choices such as the Commodore 16 and TI-99 4A. The Beeb is pretty well represented here, with a 5-star review of pole position near the front of the section, and other games later on. The standout from those is Castle Quest, which gets a half-page write-up, with the summary saying in all Castle Quest is an enjoyable game of the Cybertron mission / Hunchback ilk, which seems a little bit of a strange comparison to me, but it says not being able to save your progress throughout the game is a problem, although its features far outweigh its deficiencies, and it's given a rating of 4 out of 5 stars. There's also a 3-star rating for the BBC version of Jet Boot Jack, and a multi-platform review of the adventure Emerald Isle, which was released for the Beeb amongst many others and gets a pretty damning 2 stars. No matter what system you own, there's plenty of reviews here, and I think this section along with some of the other articles would have justified the 95p asking price. I'll move on to the final type-in listing for this episode now, and the game's called Kitchen Capers, and it's illustrated by a nice little cartoon with a bunch of spoons chasing a woman up a ladder in what looks like a supermarket. The introduction to this one says, as an extra treat for BBC owners, we bring you Kitchen Capers by top programmer Adrian Jones, a full machine code game the likes of which magazine readers will never have seen before. I did look up Adrian Jones on the BBC Micro Games archive, and this was the only game he ever produced, so I'm not sure why they're calling him a top programmer unless he wrote games for other systems. It goes on to say the program fills up a whole BBC Micro in Mode 2, the mode that it runs in, so the basic loaders must be typed in Mode 7. The first 3 are the hex dump for the game, and they have checksums at the end of each line and will tell you if you get anything wrong. The following couple of paragraphs give the instructions of what order to type the games in and save them to tape, and also how to run the completed program. It then says great care has been taken over the preparation of this game, and in capitals it says there are no printing mistakes in it. Normally when we print a game of this type we get thousands of people ringing up complaining that something must have been printed incorrectly, and it's been checked dozens of times. It then goes on to say if there's anything wrong with the reproduction we will print the corrections next month. That's after saying there's definitely no mistakes in it. It then finally gives a brief overview of what the game's about, but I'm going to leave that till we look at the in-game instructions. It then continues to inform you about the complexity of the program, saying it's written entirely in machine code and uses all available memory including disk and basic work areas. For this reason it must be typed in sections. It also says it would be impossible to explain its working in the space available, other than to say that the game uses direct screen access in Mode 2 to obtain the necessary speed, and for this reason it would be difficult to convert the program for use on other micros. The game listing then begins on the following page, and aside from a short series of basic commands at the top, the entire 4 pages of the listing consists of over 250 lines of data statements. So again, this is going to be a real chore to type in, although at least the text is printed clearly and in a relatively large size. The real kicker though is that at the bottom of the 4th page it says the rest of the program will follow in the May issue of Computer Gamer, so this listing actually spans 2 magazines, which is a very canny way of getting someone to buy the next issue. I just hope that anyone that typed it in looked at this final page before they decided to embark on this mammoth challenge. Just to quickly move back to the only legible part of the listing, the most important thing it does is check every single line of those data statements with a checksum to make sure you've typed them in correctly, and it informs you if you've got an error in any of the lines. Assuming you get past that point, the other significant thing it does is actually save all that data to disk or tape using the *save command at the bottom here. Before looking at the end product, I suppose we should now just quickly take a look at the May edition of Computer Gamer to see the rest of the listing. I'm not going to cover any of the content of this one, but here's the front cover, which shows an interesting piece of adventure style artwork which is presumably being used to promote Exodus Ultima 3, which is also mentioned on that cover. There also appears to be an in-depth look at Shadowfire and the opportunity to win a Jetsoft arcade machine. Jumping to page 83, we see the continuation of the listing for kitchen capers, and it's a colossal 9 pages, almost all of which is more of those data statements, along with the checksum and save routine at the top of each listing. The only exception is listing 4, which is a relatively short machine code routine at just over 60 lines, which seems mercifully easy to type in after all those data statements. Needless to say, this is an absolute beast of a type-in listing, with a total line count over the 4 programs coming close to 1,000. I can't see how this would possibly be worth the effort to type in, but it must surely be quite an impressive game. Let's find out. Kicking things off for this one is an instructions screen with a very snazzy Computer Gamer logo at the top. Having just seen the listing, I'm sure you'll completely understand that I've got no idea whether this was included in the original listing or added by someone typing the game in for the BBC Micro Games archive. Anyway, it says Computer Gamer presents Kitchen Capers. In this 5-screen game you must help Schubert Chef collect the food before the forks and spoons can catch him. To help Schubert get around the screen there are lifts, ladders and conveyor belts, but watch out for the bouncing cups and other dangerous objects. Hitting any key loads up the game and you're presented with another title screen with a colourful logo and an image of your player character surrounded by the keys that control him. It also tells you the other controls for the game and you're instructed to hit any key or fire, which suggests you can also use a joystick. There's also a neat scrolling message across the bottom of the screen, a feature that was very popular in games of this era. Hitting a key starts the first level, and as you may have already guessed, you're presented with a single screen platformer that has a familiar kind of look, with platforms that resemble brickwork and yellow ladders connecting them. The aim of the game, as already stated, is simply to collect all the food items on the level and avoid the moving items of cutlery. You have no way of killing the enemies, and there's also a time limit in effect, represented by a decreasing bar below the play area. If you lose a life, then the level resets and you have to collect all the items from scratch. First things first, if you had typed this in then you'd be rewarded with some really nice graphics and presentation, with multicolour animated sprites and distinctive collectibles. The sound is pretty good too, with some nice effects and short jingles between levels. In terms of gameplay, this is a classic 8-bit platformer in the Manic Miner vein, and by that I mean it's way too hard right from the start. The enemies have unpredictable movement patterns and can often change direction as you jump over them. They tend to lurk at the top of ladders too, so you have to tempt them to chase you so that you can get round them to grab the food. Your character's jump is just awful, an awkward and slow arc that you can't stop once it begins, and it's very easy to miss platforms and fall to your death, sometimes by mistakenly double jumping. The movement of the player is also incredibly sluggish, especially when you're near the top of the screen for some reason, so getting around the level is hard work even without the other hazards. The time limit runs down quite quickly and isn't really fair given how much waiting around for enemies to move you often have to do and how slow you are. You need a mixture of bravery, timing and luck to get anywhere on the first level, and after a number of tries I did manage to get to the second stage, which adds more hazards such as conveyor belts and bouncing enemies. It looked good to be fair, but on subsequent attempts I couldn't get past level 1 to try it again. As it stands, this is a good looking game, but it's way too difficult. Tweaks to make the early levels a little easier and either remove or slow down the time limit would certainly make it more playable. Further improvements could also be made, such as making the enemy movement a little more predictable or giving you a weapon or temporary shield of some kind, and really the speed and jumping of the player needs to be worked on too. Just a few of those changes could have made it a commercial quality offering, though with only 5 levels, probably only a budget one. If you understood machine code then maybe you could make some of those enhancements, but without those skills I think this would have been a disappointing return for the many hours it would have taken to type those endless data statements in. That just about does it for this episode of the history of BBC Micro typing games, and what an introduction to 1985 this has been, with some big news stories from the magazines and a bunch of games that mostly would have taken some serious commitment to type in. I don't swear often on this channel, but I think it's fitting to say that in 1985 shit got serious for BBC Micro typing games. 3 of this episode's offerings relied heavily on entering several programs and the use of machine code, which was a big step up from the simple basic listings we've seen in the majority of my previous videos. This resulted in faster, better looking games, but sadly in the case of the ones I looked at this time around, they suffered from very difficult gameplay. I'd probably go with Grand Prix as the most impressive of the games in this episode, with Camel Race clearly the worst. To be honest though, I didn't have a lot of fun with any of them, and given the complexity of the more visually impressive ones, I can't say any would have really been worth the effort to type in this time. Maybe you disagree though, and if you do then sound off in the comments. If you enjoyed this video then I'd appreciate you giving it a like, and let me know any thoughts you have about the games or magazines covered. As always, if you want to find out more about any of the content featured in this episode, check out the pinned comment for links to all the magazines and games. In the next episode of this series, I'll continue my look at 1985, covering magazines and games from June to August, and we'll see if those complex machine code games from this episode were an exception or the new norm for BBC typing games going forward. Until then, please keep your eye on this channel for more retro gaming content. Thanks very much for watching this video, and catch you in the next one.